Are we off? Yeah, okay, so I'm going to talk about making beer. I think everyone likes beer, we're all drinking it now. Hooray, hooray for beer, cheer for beer. Don't do that all the way through, it will be really distracting. Because making beer is like a slow hobby. It takes a month from when you start making the beer to when you can drink it. That's quite rewarding in a digital society. Beer's been around for thousands of years. This is an ancient Egyptian thing from the 5000 BC about making beer. Their beer then was very kind of primitive compared to what we have now. It's just basically wet bread with some malt, and that's kind of it. The kind of European kind of monks and stuff, this is a monk with some sort of octopus on their head. They've kind of specialised beer and made it a bit more like we know it today. They just used kind of hops, barley and water, basically. That was it. There was no yeast involved at that point because yeast wasn't really known about. This is the German beer purity law, came in 1516, and this is actually still in use today. And this says that beer, by definition, can only be barley, hops, and water. Again, no mention of yeast. Now, yeast is naturally occurring, so actually beer was fermented by yeast. They just didn't know it was happening because it was just floating around wild. Louis Pasteur came along and invented, didn't invent yeast, but he discovered ways of making it more repeatable to get a consistent beer time and time again. He was actually quite into beer. And that actually makes a huge difference to the taste of different beers that you can make. It's really useful. This is what homebrew equipment looks like. So if you were interested in actually doing some of the stuff I'm going to talk about, this is what you need. It costs you about 40 quid for this amount of kit, pretty cheap. And you can buy a pack of ingredients to work it for about 20 quid. So you can start making your own beer for a comparatively little amount of money. So this is the process. So the very first thing you have to do, and some of these photos are of my own brew, you have to sanitize all your equipment. Anything that's going to come into contact with the beer needs to be completely clean, chemically clean, to food grade standards, because if any bacteria gets in, the yeast is going to react with that and make weird flavours in your beer which you don't want. This is what it looks like when you start brewing. This is actually my brew. So that there is some chocolate malt. This is kind of a specialty grain that gives your beer some nice flavours, chocolatey, roasted, dark flavours. That goes in for a few minutes, half an hour maybe. You give your beer some nice flavour. Then you add the spray malt. This is kind of like sugar. I'm cheating a bit. I don't do complete all grain brewing, which is where you do this properly. But basically, this gives the yeast something to digest and actually gives your beer its kind of main flavour. So that goes in for another half an hour, and you let that all. It's like making a giant cup of tea, sort of, but beer. These are hops. The hops go in kind of like giant tea bags, and you have different types of hops for different types of aroma and flavour and bitterness, depending on what type of brew you're making. I use all British hops in mine, but there's all sorts of crazy New Zealand ones as well that do really interesting things. And then the yeast. When you've done all of that, you cool the brew down, you add more water to it, and then you put your yeast in. This is a liquid yeast that I used, and this one was really, really vigorous. It basically started fermenting almost as soon as I put it in. It was quite scary, actually. It normally takes a few days for it to activate. And that starts going through and digesting your sugar and converting it into alcohol. This is the real one in the picture, crazy. This is a hydrometer. This device tells you how much alcohol is in your beer. So you put this in, it floats, you take a reading, take another reading when the beer's finished fermenting, you subtract one number from the other, and you get the ABV for your beer, which is useful in that. This is my fermenter. This is what that particular beer actually looked like. So that actually, you can't really see from the picture, but it exploded out of the fermenter. It actually was really vigorous. That yeast was a bit too excited. But that's where the magic happens. That's where the beer starts to kind of transform and take on flavour. This is my bath full of beer bottles. So while that's all happening, you leave it for 2 weeks to ferment. You start sanitising your beer bottles, and they sanitise them in the bath, but this is just to get the labels off. Don't get in the bath with them, it's quite uncomfortable. You also have to sanitise the bottles properly so you can bottle them. The next step, so this is after 2 weeks has passed, this is some sugar that I've sanitised there. I've boiled that to remove any chemicals from it. The sugar then gets put into this vessel, and you transfer your fermented beer into there. The reason for that is so you have sugar which will carbonate the beer once you put it into bottles, which is what's happening here with my bottle capper. Props. So you siphon that into the bottles. You can just add the sugar with a teaspoon, but it's much more difficult to get that right. So that's why you add it to the whole batch in one go. And then you cap it with these, and then you leave that for another 2 weeks. So it's a month end to end, and then you can start drinking it. This isn't my setup, as you may be able to tell. This is an all-grain brewery. This is a home brewer who's doing it properly. So when I said I've cheated a bit, this is how you don't cheat. Now, I don't do that because I live in London and I don't have that much space available to, and it's also quite expensive to do that kind of stuff. This is kind of the opposite end. If you want to just do the really basic stuff, you can buy a beer kit, which is basically you just add water to some syrup and you get beer. It's not brilliant, it's not much more easy than actually just doing what I've just described. So if you were interested in making beer, I would say forget that and skip straight to extract brewing that I've just talked about. Obviously there are loads of different types of beers. I haven't got time to go through them, but the flavour profile is influenced by things like the yeast. That makes a really big difference actually to how the sugars are digested by the yeast. Also the choice of hops that you use and the types of malts as well, and that can create quite a variety. These are some of my brews. Here's one I brewed earlier. I brought a few of these in. This isn't actually this batch. This one is Obama's own beer. The White House actually does homebrew, and someone did a Freedom of Information request to get the recipe, and I followed it. Alma doesn't fuck around. These are 7.6%. So this one's quite a dark port. It's made of honey, and the other one, this one, is a kind of more American-style pale ale. So I've got a few of these. If anyone wants to try any, I'll probably get them at the end. Otherwise, yeah, that's how to brew in 5 minutes. Thanks.